Nick, does saturated fat cause heart disease?
Since we're doing rapid fire here, I'm going to say no. No, it does not. High level saturated fat can change, cholesterol levels, but the data showing that whole foods rich in saturated fat cause heart disease is rather weak. So I would not be afraid of saturated fat as a blanket statement.
Okay, all right, we're going to get back to that. If one is looking to reduce their risk of heart disease, should they try and maintain a low LDL-C or ApoB cholesterol marker?
It's one variable among many that need to be taken into context. It's a variable to consider. It's not my
Okay,
most important one.
okay. Can you live a long, healthy life on a high fat, high animal protein diet?
I think so, yes.
Will eating Oreo cookies lower my cholesterol?
I have to know more about your metabolic profile. For some people, it might work. I wouldn't say the majority, but I think that's one of the really interesting things about metabolic health is in each way we are we're each outliers in some way, I should say. And figuring out what that is allows you to get pretty profound, uh, let's say, metabolic results like lowering your cholesterol with Oreo cookies, which is possible for some people. Actually, as an aside, I know this is supposed to be quick, but that was an experiment you're alluding to that I did. I've had actually a doctor at Harvard text me the other day replicating it. Like people are doing it if they understand the physiology, it can be replicated. So, as an aside.
This is super interesting. People are going to think that I've lost the plot.
If people are really skeptical now, they're Googling off, go to PubMed, type in Oreo versus statin, see the paper, then you're going to be like, oh, now I want to come back and we'll have a little chat about physiology.
Epic. Look, Nick, I'm really, really glad that we connected. I've actually been following your work for a little while, and I think it's really important to shine a light on voices that are not necessarily being controversial for controversy's sake, but actually um, talking through different mechanisms, particularly within metabolism, that should be discussed at an academic level, because the
Mhm.
science is not settled on a lot of different things. So, before we go into this, I'd love to sort of dive into a bit of your story, into how you even came into this sort of field of keto, carnivore diets. I know that's not necessarily your whole thing, but what is sort of like your origin story, so to speak?
Yeah. So I grew up in a medical household, always wanting to be a doctor, always wanting to be a scientist. Both my parents are physicians, and my dad's a scientist as well. And grew up not thinking much about nutrition. Like I was aware of what healthy looked like from a conventional viewpoint. I knew to eat my 5 a day fruit and veg to get enough protein, to get my micronutrients, which I thought it was fine to get it from say fortified cereals. And I was a young athletic kid. So beyond that, I didn't think much about it. I think I had a perspective on nutrition and metabolic health science. I didn't even know that term at the time, metabolic health. But that was very like it's there, it's in the background, it's kind of a fluffy science. And I was, got away with that approach. It was pretty healthy through most of college. I was always pretty academic. I was an athlete, so I was a marathon runner. I did martial arts, calisthenic competitions. I have a couple state push-up records, at least for the under 18. But during college and then at the end of college into grad school, I started to deal with different metabolic health issues. I don't need to go into the nitty gritty of each of them, but my bones started to weaken, and I also developed ulcerative colitis, which is an inflammatory bowel disease. So, apologies for the graphic warning for people, but those who don't know, with ulcerative colitis, at least in my case, like I was having bloody diarrhea a dozen times a day plus. And you can imagine that is embarrassing, uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. It's not like a normal urgency. If there is blood in your intestines, that kind of irritation is next level. You can't hold it, I'll just be honest. And then there's the psychological torment on top of that. You can imagine being someone who is, perceive myself as very high achieving, athletically, academically, socially. Uh, I started to withdraw from a lot of that. Like, imagine trying to go into an exam. I wasn't even worried about picking the right answer on a test. I was worried, like, am I going to have a flare mid exam? In college, you're a young guy, you kind of want to, socialize romantically. You're not
Yeah.
going to have a girl over. You're going to be like, I had to take a break. I'm about to bleed out my ass for a minute. Kind of kills the mood. And opportunities that arose, like I'll never forget the moment. Sorry, I will always remember the moment that I had the opportunity to give the valedictory address at my college. I went to Dartmouth College. You can see it on the internet, and if you watch the video, it wasn't a very good speech, I'll be honest, but I was pretty composed. But I remember in that moment feeling the most terror I've ever felt because it was going to be in front of 11,000 people, recorded, to infinity, and I was in the midst of a flare. So I'm like, am I going to like have a flare, a bloody diarrhea in front of 11,000 people, my peers, their family, YouTube? You don't want to go viral for that. And
Mm.
so, internally, like I'm literally walking up to the stage, I'm like torn up, dying inside, but on the outside, I look composed because anybody that deals with these sort of things, there's a lot of people with invisible illnesses. You just learn to cope with it and to hide it in order to get through in life. But that's where I was. Then I finished up college, went to grad school at Oxford, and then things got their worst. And I ended up in and out of the hospital, ICU, palliative care, losing a ton of weight, like dangerously low weight. So I was so malnourished, like my heart rate just started dropping into the 20s. And I really became quite desperate. So at that point in time, I tried a lot of different things that were, quote, evidence based. We can unpack what that means because I think it has
Hmm.
a light and a dark side, the idea of evidence based medicine. But um, nothing had worked for me thus far, so I started getting experimental. And after trying a bunch of different diets, I had no foot in one diet camp. I'd rifled through basically any diet you probably heard of. I've probably tried. I tried a ketogenic diet, and for that, the response to that, it worked for me. Like it was undeniable that it worked. My symptoms improved, my inflammatory markers dropped, and eventually I got a colonoscopy and I was in biopsy-proven remission. It didn't evangelize me to that given approach, but it did pique my curiosity because it's like, okay, hold on. I've had this idea my entire life growing up that we need to like go to the most rigorous evidence, right? The randomized control trials, and that's how we're going to like determine what's smart for healthcare. And yet, that hadn't worked for me. Something that was unproven definitely did, very
Mm.
potently. And I started to, think more complexly and systemically about, how we have built the incentive structure of our current research ecosystem and how we practice Western medicine, which does amazing things. Don't get me wrong; like some of the things we've innovated are truly incredible, and Western medicine has its place. Nevertheless, the business infrastructure we built up around the food industry and the pharma industry has led to a dysfunctional set of incentive structures that think puts what I consider metabolic health in the backseat to the detriment
Hmm.
of a large population of people that suffered like me with some sort of chronic disease. And that's more or less what got me into this space.
There's a lot to unpack there. I really appreciate you sharing your story as well. I want to like go through a few terms just to keep the listener and the viewer on track with everything. But just diving a little bit deeper into your IBD, were you on drugs at the time, like disease modifying drugs or steroids or anything like that to control flares?
Yeah. First line therapy is something called mesalamine. It's not really important, but I was taking that. During flares, I take steroids, including steroid enemas. So you stick a steroid up your bum. That's more for the acute flare, but I had, tried those, and the flares kept coming back.
And the diets that you tried, so I'm assuming you tried like Mediterranean diet, high fiber diet, anti-inflammatory diet, maybe even an exclusion diet, like an elimination diet.
Yeah. The go tos you'll hear for like IBD and IBS, something called specific carbohydrate and low FODMAP.
Mm.
Did those Mediterranean, paleo, pescatarian, vegetarian, vegan, whole 30, various forms of anti-inflammatory diets, which is kind of like a fluffy umbrella term. But yeah, no, I had tried a lot of things before I tried a ketogenic diet, which I had my biases against just because of how it's talked about in the
Yeah.
mainstream.
Yeah. So it sounds like, to go all the way to keto, you would have gone through all the other diets before getting to that point because it is quite an outlier. I don't want to say extreme but I want to say an outlier diet in terms of the steps to get there. It's very, very different to a Mediterranean diet. And we'll get to exactly what we mean when we say ketogenic diet, because I've heard you say there is no such thing as a ketogenic diet. There is ketosis, and there are ways in which to get to ketosis.
Yeah.
So I want to unpack that a bit. But when you were going through these different diets, I'm assuming you were doing it in a rigorous scientific way as a scientist yourself, looking at subjective markers of improvement, maybe not inflammation markers, because otherwise you'd be going and getting your bloods done, however long you were doing the diet for. But was that sort of the process you were going through when it came to your response?
I would say that I tried it rigorously insofar that like I designed the diet in the best way possible that I thought would maximize the outcome. So, for example, if I do a vegetarian diet, it's not like I'm slamming Oreo cookies because they're vegetarian. I'll leave that for later. But it would be like a whole foods vegetarian diet. I wasn't like getting like weekly markers and trying to analyze, everything that was happening with biomarkers because quite honestly, I didn't care. I just
Yeah.
wanted to feel better. So all
Yeah.
that mattered to me, and I think people can empathize with this, is like, you're going to base what you do in terms of your lifestyle on how you feel.
Hmm.
And sometimes, and we'll get into this, you can feel really great, and then something can happen in your biomarkers that is, let's say, at odds with how you feel, or perceived to be at odds with how you feel. So you try one thing and you feel amazing, and then you look at your biomarkers like, hang on, what happened there?
Mm.
That's not good. Nevertheless, when you're coming from a place where I was, you know, you go with how you feel. Like, if you say, oh, this biomarker might shed 5 years off my life, but I don't have to be sitting in the hospital, emaciated, brain fog, socially withdrawn, then, you give up the 5 years. So I was basing up basically on how I felt, but I did the diets and what I thought was a rigorous manner, and importantly, for a sufficient time to give it an effort. It's not like I tried 3 days and I'm like, nah, it's not working, move on. Like I gave it several weeks, as one should, provided I didn't have very negative side effects. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. And so when you describe a ketogenic diet that you were on and perhaps still practice now, I'm no doubt it might have fluctuated in terms of the exact number of or the amount of saturated fats and the amount of protein that you consume every single day. Where did you get your information from at the time? Because it would have been quite fringe. I mean, how long ago was this? Sorry, just to give some time context.
June 1st, 2019 was when I started a ketogenic diet.
Oh wow, okay, right. So about 6 years ago. So yeah, where were you getting the information around the ketogenic diet potentially being useful for IBD?
I did have one doctor. Ironically, she was the doctor that treated my dad for obesity. He went through her weight loss program. And my dad's like, you'd really get along with this doctor. Her name is Vivian Lowe. And I'm like, Dad, like, I'm trying to gain weight here. Like, she just helped you lose 50 pounds. I'm not going to do an obesity doctor. But she was someone who was pretty open minded and versed in metabolic health and was the first person to, I can't believe I'm going to use this word, but I would say the first physician outside my family to give me permission to even entertain a ketogenic diet. I think at the
Mm,
time, you just hear so much about it negatively from conventionalists that it almost like, if you're kind of in that ecosystem, isn't something, at least in 2019, I entertained as like this is a viable thing to do, which sounds silly now to me. But I think her saying, look, this might work. What do you have to lose? And then mostly getting my information from her and from the internet. I mean, it's not that hard to design a diet that puts you into ketosis. It's like, all right, I get the principle. Cut out the carbs, drop your liver glycogen stores, up the fats, go into ketosis. I can do that. So yeah, I just kind of like, pardon the pun, but threw spaghetti at the wall with that approach, and lo and behold, my life took a hairpin turn.
I love that. I love that pun. You literally threw the spaghetti at the wall, and never touched it again. So so in terms of the keto diet, let's define that for folks if they haven't come across this before, because I think keto within the mainstream is just whipping butter into your coffee and having a bunch of protein. But I think it's poorly understood
Mm-hmm.
by folks. So when you say ketogenic diet or ketosis, what are we actually referring to?
Right. So let's start with the idea of ketosis. So what is ketosis? Ketosis is a metabolic state where there are ketone bodies in your blood. Starting there, I think it's pretty obvious. It's named a ketogenic diet because you go into ketosis. Ketosis is having ketones in your blood. Then we can ask, what are ketones? Well, ketone bodies are these really interesting molecules. The main circulating one's called beta hydroxybutyrate. And one thing they do is fuel your brain. They fuel other organs too, but I focus on the brain because people might have heard like the brain consumes a lot of energy and it's kind of a picky eater. So it likes to run on glucose, at least when you're eating a mixed diet. Now, if you think evolutionarily, if we have these big brains and they like to run on sugar, and we didn't always have access to food, what happens if you don't have food? Well, if your brain needs sugar, where are you going to get the sugar? You're going to break down lean tissue. And if you do that in an evolving, human ape, then you're going to break down your lean tissue quickly and starve to death in a matter of days and weeks. We need more robustness during evolution. So our body became much better at upregulating the system called ketosis, where we turn our stored fat into fuel for the brain. So, an analogy I've used before, not in a long time, but maybe it'll resonate with people if they aren't familiar with this concept, is if you think of your brain as a fireplace, and you want to keep the fire going, and you think of the fat molecules as like these long chains of carbons. So it's kind of like maybe a tree outside or a really long log. You can't take a full tree, bring it into the house, and toss it into the fireplace. It doesn't work. You have to chop it up into little bits that can actually cross into the house, cross into the fireplace, in this case, crossing the blood-brain barrier. And those are ketone bodies. So our body takes these long fats that we have stored, processes them into ketone bodies, and the ketone bodies can fuel the brain. So the brain isn't sucking up, glucose in the form of, processed lean tissue, processed protein. So that's one face of it. That's a way to think about, why are humans good at getting into ketosis? Much better than other animals. It's because we have a big brain and we need to be able to fuel it, even when we don't have carbs available, which we didn't always have. But that is not even the interesting thing. You can think of ketones as signaling as fuel, but they're also signaling molecules. So they're kind of like two-faced molecules. On the one hand, yes, they're firewood you can throw into the fireplace of the brain metabolism. On the other hand, they themselves are actually basically hormones. Like they secrete into the blood, they bind to receptors in cells and on cells, and alter the ways our cells function at a very fundamental level. They can change gene expression. They can bind to proteins and change the function of those proteins. These are things called, sorry for the jargon, but post-translational modifications, basically putting a tag on another protein and then changing that protein's function, kind of like a dimmer switch or an on-off switch. So ketosis becomes a very interesting metabolic state because it's not just you're running on a different fuel. It's like you are rewriting your body's metabolism. And almost every organ, if not every organ, is affected in a pretty fundamental and powerful way.
Gotcha. Okay. So because of evolution and because we have required the ability to withstand famine, let's say, during our long history, we would have had to have adapted a way in which we can utilize stored fat on our body as fuel. And that's one of the uses for ketones, but it's also, like you're saying, it's much more than just a fuel source. It's signaling, it's acting like a hormone. In terms of this transition from utilizing ketone bodies by the brain, am I right in thinking that it's not a complete transition? So your liver is still going to be pumping out glucose as a result of gluconeogenesis. Your brain will still utilize glucose, but the proportion of glucose utilization by your brain versus ketones goes more towards ketones in terms of the proportionality when you're in this ketotic state.
Exactly. So it's glucose sparing is what we would say.
Okay. Gotcha.
I think, your brain can run on up to like 60 to 70% ketones, but not 100%.
Gotcha.
That is true.
Okay. Great. And then in terms of the ketogenic diet then,
Yep.
how would you describe that in the context of what ketosis is? Because I imagine it's different for different people.
Yeah. So, obviously you can, based on what I just talked about, if you don't eat You're not eating carbs, and you're going to turn your body fat into ketones. That works to get to ketosis. So prolonged fast. It's not very sustainable because very prolonged fasts are called starvation and you die, which is a negative side effect of any diet. Um, but what you can do is just shift your dietary intake to have very little carbohydrate and fat, and then you're turning the dietary fat to ketone bodies. So the ketogenic diet first became a medical intervention around 1921, I believe, for epilepsy. So treatment-resistant epilepsy. Doctors and researchers found that you put kids with epilepsy on ketogenic diet and their seizures tend to go away. That's interesting. So it's been a medical treatment for epilepsy for a long period of time. But like I said, ketones alter metabolism in many different ways. So in the past few years, decade or so, the use cases for a ketogenic diet, and more broadly, I guess you could say, therapeutic carbohydrate reduction, because you can get benefits out of reducing your carbs and the glycemic load of your diet, depending on your use case, even if you don't get into full blown ketosis. But the use cases of ketogenic diet have expanded massively. So it affects the brain. We know that. So now it's being explored for bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, other mental health disorders and neurological diseases, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, etc. Either even a case report on, say, ALS. So central nervous system disorders, autoimmune and inflammatory conditions, multiple sclerosis. I think there's a phase 2 trial on that.
Mm.
And then insulin resistance disorders like obesity and diabetes are now all kind of within the umbrella of potential use cases for ketogenic diet therapy. As for what the diet is, as I described, it's just eating in a way that brings you to ketosis. That does require a very low carbohydrate diet. But beyond that, it makes no comment on the source of the proteins which you need and the fat in the diet. So you can have, the way I like to think about it is it's perpendicular to other diets. And what I mean by that is, if you think about, like, there's a dimension on which you say this is the source of the food. So say like animal based or from a particular region like the Mediterranean region, or plant based, that's one axis. The other axis is what the macronutrient breakdown is. You can get your protein from tofu, you can get your protein from eggs. So you can design a ketogenic diet lots of different ways. The fundamental piece is carbs low and sufficient protein, and then fat high enough to get you into a sustainable state of ketosis, which you can measure in different ways. But the best way is just take a little meter and then prick your finger and get a little bit of blood and just do a capillary measurement. Basically, the blood measure of ketones is the most reliable way.
Is there, I don't know, I haven't come across this technology, but in the same way we have continuous glucose monitors now, do you think there is technology out there that measures ketones over the course of a day?
There are continuous ketone monitors. I will say I've beta tested 2. They're not very accurate. Maybe the technology has been updated. I tested them last maybe about a year ago. So maybe it's been updated. I remember mine being relatively precise but not accurate. And what I mean by that is, like, you could track if you go up and down, but if you cross-reference the actual number to, say, a finger stick, it wasn't really on the mark, at least for me. So the technology is there. You can access them. I just didn't find them particularly useful. But we are expanding the universe of continuous metabolite monitors beyond CGMs, continuous glucose monitors. So I would say in 5 years, we're going to have CLMs for lactate, CKMs for ketones, and hopefully a lot more.
Gotcha. Yeah. I look forward to that. And just for the avoidance of doubt for the listener, when we talk about ketosis, we're talking about nutritional ketosis here rather than ketoacidosis,
Yes.
a state that you see within, diabetics, for example, coming in as an emergency, which are very, very different reference ranges when it comes to measuring those ketones on
Right.
capillary
So
measurements.
I think this is an important distinction for people, because if you're a normal healthy person, say you don't have type 1 diabetes, you're not going to get into that dangerous place of ketoacidosis, probably, because how it works is there's kind of like a feedback mechanism. So there's a lot of things called negative feedback loops in the body, where the product of a pathway will inhibit its production. And this keeps things from just getting out of control and spinning out of control. But say you have type 1 diabetes, What that means is you're not producing insulin. Your body doesn't produce its own insulin, and insulin shuts down fat cells. It stops them from releasing fatty acids. So if you don't have that break on the fat cell, then the fat cell can keep spewing out fatty acids that get turned into ketones, and you can get into a state where, yeah, ketone levels go super high. So, comparison of like nutritional ketosis, like 0.5 millimoles to say, say 3 millimoles is kind of like a normal range. In diabetic ketoacidosis, your levels are at like 10, 11, 12 or more.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a different magnitude of things. Like a healthy blood sugar, 90 milligrams per deciliter is different than having a blood sugar of 900.
Yeah.
So yeah,
We're going to go back to some of the potential use cases for nutritional ketosis, because this is really super interesting, looking at all the potentials across different dimensions, particularly around brain health. Seems to be centered around brain health there, but also inflammatory bowel disease. We've used the term metabolic health quite a bit, and I think that means different things to different people. So perhaps we should talk about what we mean by good metabolic, what metabolic health means, and how we measure the determinants of good metabolic health as well. And I think this also sparks an interesting conversation about what is a good biomarker.
Yeah. That's a really important question, and I think one that often gets overlooked, so I'm glad you asked it. That said, I think we need to acknowledge that there are terms we have when it comes to health that are kind of umbrella terms that people understand, just viscerally, and then there's the ones that we can operationalize in science, which means like this term has like a concrete definition that can be measured. So I'll give you another example, and then I'll answer your question, is ultra-processed foods. If I tell you avoid ultra-processed foods, or your audience, they know what I mean, right? Don't eat Doritos, candy bars, right? But you have to ask the question like, well, why aren't we talking about them, say, in the dietary guidelines? Or, why is it so hard to study these things? And it's because, well, how do you really define it? Like, how do you really, really define it? Because you need to know what are the biologically relevant changes that are happening to food. And just having this umbrella term of like, this thing is a processed food doesn't tell you how it's interacting with biology. So it's hard to define and it's hard to study. It doesn't mean that it's a bad term. It just means, the term has a different use. So it's like a heuristic. And I would say the same is true of metabolic health. People know it when they see it, or they kind of get a sense of what it is, but it doesn't have a concrete definition in science. What I would say metabolic health is to me is that your body's machinery, the subcellular, cellular, and organ and system. Sorry, I didn't get much sleep last night. And systems level, how your body is really running and operating is in a manner that minimizes chronic disease risk and maximizes function, physical function, mental function. So you're just running at your best. That's broadly how I think of metabolic health. And just as another kind of quippy thing, one person on Instagram Live once said, "Hey, Nick, in 5 words, how do you define metabolic health?" And on the spot, my immediate reaction was, your best life insurance policy, something like that.
Okay.
Your best life insurance. So it's a fluffy term, but those are the ways I think about it. Now, you can get a sense, or I would say you can look at biomarkers to tell you if you aren't in good metabolic health. Like there are canaries in the coal mine. So if you have a high insulin resistance score, very high fasting insulin, high triglycerides, which are a form of fat in the blood, or low HDL cholesterol or low triglyceride to HDL ratio, a lot of inflammation. These are all markers of poor metabolic health. I say that with exceptions. With any given biomarker, there's an exception. So are you in poor metabolic health if you're pregnant and your insulin's high? No. If you just worked out and your inflammatory marker spike, that's not bad. That's a good thing. So there's always exceptions with this, but I would say in the general sense, having a healthy fasting, insulin healthy, blood sugar healthy, levels of fat in the blood, low inflammation are all signs that you're more metabolically healthy.
Okay, so let's riff on that for a bit, because I think generally most people would agree that if you're not insulin resistant, and we can measure that using some biomarkers, your triglycerides are low, your apolipoprotein B numbers are low. And we've talked about ApoB on the podcast before as a sort of umbrella marker for some of the atherogenic lipoproteins that are associated with cardiovascular disease, and some other markers that you mentioned, or maybe even looking at visceral fat or DEXA, et cetera, et cetera. But within this, and this will bring us on to the Oreo cookie study, that might need a little bit of background into, your particular phenotype, your physical characteristics on a low carb diet. Within that, you can have improvements in your biomarker while still actually engaging in unhealthy behaviors, as you went through in your N of 1 experiment. So this sort of brings up a bit of a conundrum, because you can almost gamify some of these biomarkers to prove on paper that you are quote unquote metabolically healthy, while still actually engaging in some unhealthy behaviors, as anyone would heuristically know, ergo eating Oreo cookies.
Yeah. I love the way you say gamify. I think it's a really good way to describe it. And maybe speaking to, if I put on my medical student hat for a moment, and speak to this in a way that I think doctors will understand. If you ever take an endocrinology is hormone science, or being a hormone doctor if you're an endocrinologist. Endocrinology 101, what they'll tell you is, if you get a lab report back, and everybody's probably seen their own lab reports, right? There are some things that are in the black, meaning they're in the normal range. And then you see the numbers that pop out at you because they're red. And red means they're out of the reference range. And what an endocrinologist will tell you is, ignore the colors, because there's no such thing as a normal range. It's whether it's appropriate. And so I'll give you an example, something called parathyroid hormone. A parathyroid hormone is released from your parathyroid glands, which are under thyroid glands. One thing it does is it defends the calcium in your blood. People don't need to understand the axis, the physiology. I'm just giving an example of how one hormone controls an outcome measure. If this hormone is signaling to, say, get calcium out of the bones into your bloodstream, if your calcium is low, then if you have, say, a vitamin D deficiency or low blood calcium, where you want this hormone is high. That's what we would call appropriately high, because then it's responding to a metabolic circumstance. By contrast, if your calcium in your blood is very high, you should get this report back and see the parathyroid hormone is actually red but low. That's appropriately low. And if it was in the black, if it was in the normal reference range, but your calcium was high, you'd say it's inappropriately normal. I might be losing people. The high level point here is, a given biomarker needs to be taken in the broader context. So as much as I can say low insulin is good, or you might say generally low ApoB is better, you have to say, well, what is the context? And if something is off, why is it off? I think that's how you think like a scientist in the realm of health. So with that said, the experiment that we've been teasing people about was one where I literally used Oreo cookies, adding them to my diet, not swapping anything out. I literally just added Oreo cookies in addition to my diet to lower a biomarker that people think is bad, which is LDL cholesterol, or an associated biomarker is ApoB. In this case, just think about them as interchangeable. I have very high cholesterol. We can go into why that is, but the reason for my cholesterol I actually do understand. At least I think I understand. And that understanding of the underlying physiology lets me make predictions and do pretty crazy things, including saying, hey, guess what? I'm going to do a party trick. And that party trick is I'm going to do a study. Now, I'm saying this as in this is how it evolved. I actually announced publicly I was going to do this study before I did it. I said, I'm going to do a study. I'm going to, for my high cholesterol, take a lipid-lowering medication, so a statin. In fact, a high-dose statin, 20 milligrams of Crestor. It's like a gorilla statin. This is standard of care therapy for very, very high cholesterol. But I'm going to do it and compare it to something else, and what's called a crossover study. So a crossover study is when you do one intervention, then you do another intervention. So I am my own control. I'm comparing statin therapy to some other intervention, with the outcome being my cholesterol levels. Let's see what lowers my cholesterol more. And the other intervention was I keep eating what I'm eating. I kind of lock in a baseline diet, but I add Oreo cookies, 12 per day, which is one sleeve of Oreos if you know your Oreo math, but 100 grams of carbs and just pure Oreo cookies. And I said, I'm gonna do this experiment where I lock in my diet, I have a run-in period, and I get my lipids, my cholesterol. Then I'm gonna eat Oreo cookies. I ended up doing it for 16 days. Measure what happens to my cholesterol. Then I'm gonna do a washout to kind of reset. That's what you do in a crossover trial, at least the good ones. There are some bad ones where they don't. That's a whole nother kettle of fish. But I do a washout period for 3 months to reset, and then I'm gonna take 6 weeks of high dose statin. And I gave the statin 6 weeks because that's conventional for a statin. So I wanted to give the statin fair play. So I gave it more time than the Oreos. And I only gave the Oreos 16 days because I'll just put it this way. If you want to try at home, and don't actually try this, but if you were in theory to try locking in a diet and then eating a sleeve of Oreo cookies, 12 Oreo cookies in addition to your diet every single day, it becomes hard fast. It really does. Especially if you're used to being, carb and sugar free. So it hit me like a train, I'll admit it. But the result was the Oreo cookies lowered my LDL cholesterol by 71% in 16 days. And the statin lowered it by 32.5%. So the Oreo cookies were 2 times as powerful as high intensity statin therapy. $1 trillion drug market. It was 2 times as powerful, the Oreo cookies versus the statin, in 1/3 of the time. And it's a funny thing because on the one hand, you see the headlines, like, I'm baiting the headlines trying Harvard medical student or Harvard scientist lowers cholesterol with Oreo cookies. I mean, I'm completely transparent. I was engineering this experiment to do that, and it did work. I'm not coy about that. This is clearly clickbait, and you can call it that. But in this day and age, it's a tool. Clickbait's a tool. I don't think clickbait's a bad thing per se, provided there's a purpose and there's nuance. And so you could say, yeah, this is a stunt. And I'm like, well, it's a stunt that I predicted based on physiology, then pulled off and published on with the support of my PCP, the Harvard IRB exemption. I know how to dot my I's and cross my T's, and a very senior lipidologist on the paper. This is legitimate physiology. You can call it clickbait, but it's also real science that's pointing to something we don't understand. And so it was engineered to provoke emotions, because what I have here is not a value judgment on LDL, not a value judgment on statins, not a value judgment on Oreos. But I know people think Oreos are unhealthy. I think we generally agree on that. And I also know people think high cholesterol is bad. So all I've presented is a scenario where a human being, let's say you're the doctor and a human being, a patient, walks into your office. And you just notice this human being has done something very stupid that is a bad intervention, eating a bunch of Oreo cookies, but they had a good outcome, or what you think is a good outcome, their cholesterol being lowered. And so you need to reconcile that. You need to say, well, if there's a bad intervention and a good outcome, there's a paradox. If there's a paradox, it means there's something we don't understand. So the experiment and others that I've done are engineered to be provocative, but to bring people in and say, hey, isn't this interesting? Now let's talk about what's going on. Not to judge an individual's lifestyle choice, but to say, this is an era where academia, Jade Tower academia, which used to be very siloed, is forced to interact with the general public. We as academicians are forced to talk to the general public. And if we don't step up to that responsibility, rando influencers are going to, and they do. And then I know a lot of my colleagues get all pissy. It's like, well, this is beneath us. We don't want to engage. I'm like, you kind of have to. We have to find a way to engage in this engagement bait environment. And I'm figuring out how to do it. That was one example. And it does bring people to the table and get conversations started. So I've been on my soapbox for a minute. Pause for questions, reflections.
Yeah. So there's so much to unpack there. I think for the avoidance of doubt, what your experiment was trying to prove was nothing to do with the health effects of consuming Oreos and reducing ApoB. And that's not a suggestion to people to remove their statins in place of an ultra-processed cookie every single day. But what you did, and I think the important note, just to underscore, was that you called your shot before the study. So you weren't just messing around and like, oh, I wonder what happens. You actually predicted using your model what would occur to your blood results, and we can go into why that is for your specific case. But I want folks to appreciate that at home, that we're not saying that this is a replacement treatment for cholesterol lowering therapy. So perhaps to add a bit more context to the N of 1 experiment, we could talk a bit about your prior diet. So what your diet was looking like before in terms of the amount of carbohydrates, fat, and protein you were consuming in general sort of macronutrient ratios. Whether actually that pushed you out of ketosis, nutritional ketosis, using your blood markers, and why this is specific to a particular phenotype that I believe either you or your colleagues have coined in terms of the terminology of the lean mass hyperresponder, which I'll be honest, I would have never come across had it not been for your content online.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love to get into all of that. Before I do, I just want to give a major hat tip to my colleagues in this space. My chief colleagues are Dave Feldman, software engineer turned obsessive lipidologist, and a friend of mine, Adrian Sotomota, professor over in Mexico. They are truly like brothers to me. Science is fun. When you do it with people that feel like family, it is the greatest gift. So I'm really appreciative for them and all of the work they've done with me on this research. Now, with that bromance post-included, yeah, so we've been studying this very interesting thing that happens when some people go low carb. Their LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, just skyrockets, goes into space. Now, this is really important to study because we've alluded to the fact that ketogenic diets are becoming more mainstream and more useful clinically for a broad range of conditions. Literally, doctors treating their patients with schizophrenia with a ketogenic diet. Like, remarkable things. And yes, the data are still being developed. It's still early stages, but the potential for ketogenic therapy in medicine is incredible. If you could put it in a pill, it would be the most, lucrative pharmaceutical of all time. But you can't. That said, there's a boogeyman. There's a speed bump, a very big speed bump, and that is the cholesterol boogeyman, where doctors are afraid and patients are afraid that if they go keto and are eating a lot of fat, their cholesterol will go up. And the way we think about it viscerally is like having very high cholesterol is like basically like equivalent to having poor heart health and having a heart attack. So we need to understand, one, why does this happen in some people? Mind you, it's a minority of people. Most people don't see their LDL and ApoB go up on ketogenic diets. We can actually explain why that is. But some do. And we have to understand why it's going up in those people. Now, I think the most pertinent thing for your audience is to describe why some, like, what would predict some people having an increase and some people not. And the interesting thing there is the main predictor is actually how lean you are. So leaner people, those that are insulin sensitive with lower BMIs, tend to be the ones to see increases. In fact, we have a meta-analysis, which is a group of studies of 41 human randomized trials, looking at the trials and saying what predicts an increase in LDL when people go low carb, and BMI is the predictor. In fact, having a normal BMI, a BMI under 25, is 5 times as potent a predictor as being in the top quartile of saturated fat intake. So compared to thinking like, yeah.
So just to confirm, sorry for the listener, is this the BMI before they've embarked on a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet? Okay. Mm-hmm.
The BMI at any given time. So we even see it where, for example, what I'm building towards is the leaner you are, the higher LDL tends to go. And if you have overweight or obesity, you tend not to see LDL increases. However, it's so dynamic. So I've seen patients who start at, they're 300, 350 pounds, they go keto, and their LDL stays stable and even drops, but then they keep losing weight. And then they hit like a BMI of like 26, 25, and then their LDL just takes a hairpin turn and shoots through the roof. So it's a dynamic thing, and it's really interesting. But to, let's say, put someone's mind at ease, if they want to use a ketogenic diet or carb restriction for, say, diabetes, obesity, which is probably still the most common use case, if you're overweight or have obesity, or type 2 diabetes, you're unlikely to see your LDL go up by any substantial margin. Sometimes there's a transitional period when it blips up, but you're unlikely to be one of these people that has the LDL jump from 90 to 400, which we do see,
Okay.
but we see it in the lean, insulin sensitive people like me. So when I went keto, I actually started a ketogenic diet. It was very low saturated fat, actually lots of fiber and greens, very little red meat, lots of fish. And my LDL still went from 90, 95-ish to like well over 300 and then to over 500.
Gosh.
So I wasn't guzzling butter or anything. I was eating a pretty low saturated fat diet, and yet my LDL went through the roof. To give a very simple explanation of why we think this happens, it's when you're lean and insulin sensitive, your body's much better at releasing free fatty acids from your fat cells. And this kicks off a cycle. We call it the lipid energy model, basically, where the fat needs to get repackaged into these shipping containers that contain cholesterol as well. And then they get trafficked around the body. So, people, if they want the details, they can look up lipid energy model. We have a paper on it. But the high level idea is if you're lean and insulin sensitive, your liver starts spitting out these cholesterol and fat containing particles so that the fat can be trafficked back to your little depleted fat cells and your muscles to fuel the muscles. And the result of this is very high LDL along with high HDL and low triglycerides. So
Mm-hmm.
the official definition of a phenotype that I have called lean mass hyperresponders is having an LDL above 200, an HDL above 80, and a triglyceride below 70, all in milligrams per deciliter. That is the definition. If you pass those three markers, LDL above 200, HDL above 80, triglycerides below 70, definitionally you are a lean mass hyperresponder.
Okay,
And people will notice.
Just for the UK folks, so because we use millimoles per liter here, so in terms of the conversion, I've just got a conversion chart in front of me. So we've got 200 milligrams per deciliter is the equivalent of around 5.2 of your LDL-C, and then did you say 80 milligrams of HDL?
Yes.
So that's around 2.1 millimoles per liter.
Yes.
And then your triglycerides is slightly different in terms of the weight. So that will be
0.8, I think.
0.8, yes, 0.8, yeah.
Lower than 0.8. Lower than 0.8. So I would say,
yeah, lower than 0.8.
For the millimoles, LDL above 5.2, HDL above 2.1, and triglycerides below 0.8.
Gotcha.
I think.
Okay. Gotcha. Thereabouts.
Yes.
Okay. I'll add a conversion table to the show notes so people can check to see that. Okay.
We have all these graphs with the 280, 70, and it's just in my brain. We should definitely put parentheses with the millimole conversion.
Yeah.
I admit, I didn't have that on the top of my head. I'm like, it's divided by 38.67.
Yeah.
Triglycerides. So, Oxford would be ashamed of me. I never learned my conversion.
Okay.
Yes, that is the definition. And I just want to add, when I gave that definition, I didn't give a BMI criteria. And that's because there's actually no official BMI criteria. It's just that this triad is very rare in people with obesity. Maybe with the exception of people that have very low body fat but higher BMIs. So if you're like a Dominic D'Agostino type, people know who he is, like super muscular person but higher BMI because he's so muscular, like The Rock or something, then maybe. But for your average person, with a BMI that is more or less commensurate with an average body fat at that BMI, then yeah, you typically have a BMI that's less than 25 if you're going to hit those markers. Okay. There are outliers.
So,
predictor.
Gotcha. Okay. So for people who have embarked on a low carb or ketogenic diet to improve their type 2 diabetes, what you're saying is generally, particularly if their BMI is above, let's say 25. I know there's not a specific marker here, but you don't see this corresponding increase in LDL cholesterol, ApoB, and triglycerides. In fact, you often see either a stabilization or a reduction. And actually, colleagues of mine that utilize low carb in general practice as a very effective form of therapy, metabolic therapy, would say the same thing as well. But there is a particular phenotype which you ascribe to yourself where you see the opposite in a lot of these parameters. In fact, a very high LDL-C. And am I right in thinking yours is like in sky high, like familial cholesterol
Yeah,
cholesterol high?
over 500.
Over
Um,
500.
yes, over 500. So
Wow.
in millimoles, that is like around 13.
That I don't even have that on my chart. That's so high. So
No,
that's
it's no. Most doctors have never seen a number that high. As in, like, I have a PhD and I'm about to finish medical school, and if I go to the Harvard Medical School campus and tell a senior doctor, "Oh, I have a patient with an LDL of 500," and I've done this, not saying it's me, they're like, "Nah, you must be mistaken." And then I show them the lab chart again, my name redacted. They're like, "This must be a lab error. It must be."
wow.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
they have
That I
a very rare genetic condition called familial hypercholesterolemia, the homozygous form, which is something like 1 in 1 million. That is a very severe condition, but is distinct from the phenotype I have. So just to draw like that distinction, because people do confuse it. In fact, if you've heard people like Peter Attia and other people who talk about this stuff talk about lipid levels on low carb diets, they often bring up the example of familial hypercholesterolemia. That is a very different thing than what I have, because in that case you have a genetic dysfunction where basically you can't take up lipid particles. So your genetics have
mm,
broken your lipid metabolism. You are born with sky high levels. If I eat a standard American diet or an Oreo cookie rich diet, my LDL is 80, 90, totally normal. Again, milligrams per deciliter. But if I go low carb, it goes through the roof. And then I add back carbs, it comes back down. So it is a metabolic response to carbohydrate restriction, probably an adaptive one. And when I say adaptive, I mean to meet daily demands, because you can't have something that is momentarily adaptive but long-term harmful. It's called antagonistic pleiotropy, or that's in the category of it. People want to go down the rabbit hole on that. But that aside, what's really, really interesting about this population, and the reason everybody in medicine and health should care about it, not just lean mass hyperresponders, is there are very few times in the natural world where like nature just hands us the perfect natural experiment to investigate a question that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do in such a rigorous manner. So, what question am I talking about? Well, the lipid heart hypothesis. People
mm,
talk about high LDL, high ApoB driving cardiovascular disease, and a question that's remained is that high LDL alone just sufficient to be like, you mentioned the word atherogenic, heart disease causing, forcing by just bulk flow. I think people imagine the particles containing cholesterol floating around the blood. They just like force their way, into the blood vessel wall, and then the plaque grows. And that's kind of the way we think about it. Um, but there are a couple problems with the current literature. One, most people being studied are metabolically unhealthy because most of the
mm-hmm,
population is metabolically unhealthy. So that's a different circumstance. Then, two, the only other scenario where we have very high LDL and decent metabolic health at a population level is this familial hypercholesterolemia. But that's a different scenario because you have a broken lipid metabolism. So,
mm-hmm,
in studying people like me, we have the first population ever where we have isolated high LDL as a variable in a metabolically healthy context. And we can ask the question, well, one, why is this occurring mechanistically? But two, what's the risk profile? And I actually have a surprise for you. First, I have to ask, can we hold this podcast for a couple of weeks before release?
yeah, we can
Okay.
do that.
That's because the trial that has been years in the making, the prospective trial where we are assessing these people like me, tracking them over time for heart disease progression, we found out 2 days ago that the paper was accepted.
Wow.
So it's
Okay.
about.
Congrats.
Thanks. So this is big news. It's embargoed until the paper comes out, but provided we're not dropping this podcast until I give you the go ahead, I will talk about it. Before I do, I just really need to again reinforce that this comes from the blood, sweat, and tears of my friend, colleague, brother Dave Feldman, who, there are a few people in science who have so much intellectual integrity to have risked their entire life's work on taking a pivot, doing something extreme. And what he has done in provoking this question is unprecedented. Having made an observation, put it out publicly, crowd-funded a clinical trial is nothing short of incredible. And just to put in another plug, it's become so big that there's actually a movie around this research that will be public probably around September. I have seen the first screening of the movie. We did it in February in Vegas before a conference, and it is the first thing on the big screen that actually brought tears to my eyes. It's that good. It
Wow.
weaves the human elements with the science so beautifully. So people should absolutely see it. It's called Cholesterol Code. You can look it up. There's a movie website. Anyway, that all aside, the trial that Dave got up and running was to take 100 people like me and measure, one, is there plaque in their blood vessels after so much
Hmm.
time on a ketogenic diet? That paper was published a little while ago. Actually ended up being the number one most read paper in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology Advances for 2024. Proud of our team for that. But then we followed them over a year with high resolution cardiac imaging, coronary CT angiography. And yeah, the paper was just accepted. And the results were that for the vast majority, there was no or minimal plaque progression. That this population did not appear to be a high risk population on the whole, despite having astronomical LDL levels. And more to the point, because you're always going to see progression in a large enough population. It just happens with aging and time. Being a lean mass hyperresponder doesn't make you impervious to LDL. Ask the question: what predicted plaque advancement? What predicted over that time if you had plaque that grew? And LDL and ApoB did not predict progression. So across the spectrum of people, LDLs from 200 to 591, LDL just in ApoB did not predict. It just wasn't important in predicting whether or not plaque progressed, which sounds heretical, but it's what the data showed. You can see the graphs when the paper comes out. What did predict whether or not plaque will progress. Sorry, getting no sleep. By the way, sleep is good for your heart as well. Get it? Do as monkeys say, not as monkeys do. But what did predict it was baseline plaque. So if people had plaque at baseline, as measured in this case by a coronary artery calcium scan, it did predict more plaque progression. So the punchline is, in this population, having plaque begets more plaque, but LDL and ApoB do not. And that's a
Hmm.
really important finding, because it doesn't say it doesn't say like ApoB and LDL aren't important. It says, or it reinforces, I should say, in the era where we have monitoring that you can go and get a functional test and measure the plaque in your heart. That is the best thing you can do. There is a lot of diversity, a lot of heterogeneity in how different people have plaque buildup or not in response to having high LDL. So you can guess, you can speculate, but the best thing is to get a measurement of your own plaque levels. And if you have plaque already, it probably predicts more plaque progression and you should be more conservative. If you don't, and we can go through individual patient case examples, it's pretty reassuring, even if you have high LDL. So actually, I will just give you one example because I think human examples are pertinent. That of my own mother.
Hmm.
My mother, she's a physician, so she can did make her own health decisions, but she's had high LDL her whole life. Her LDL in milligrams per deciliter, apologies for people needing to do the conversions again, but has been above 160 basically her whole life. Generally above 200. And years ago, she
Hmm.
went low carb, and she's very small and lean. She's about 105, 110 pounds. I don't think she'd mind me saying that. um, and she became a lean mass hyperresponder. So her LDL has been in the 300s and 400s. So over the course of her life, on April 10th of this year, so in a couple months, she turns 60. Over the course of her life, she's had a lot of exposure to LDL. So you might think with all that LDL exposure, she might have plaque. She ended up getting a coronary CT angiography and she had zero plaque, no measurable plaque, despite having a huge exposure over her lifetime. For her, she decided, okay, I don't think I'm actually that high a risk, and the literature would support that. So she decided not to take lipid lowering therapy. She decided I don't want to take a statin or a PCSK9 inhibitor or ezetimibe. I'm okay being not treated, given I've had high exposure and I don't have plaque. If the results had turned out, oh, she actually has a lot of plaque, that she probably would have started a statin or other medication. So it's very individualized, and I think
Yeah.
this research is provocative because it says, well, one, just because you have super high LDL, even as high as say 600, it doesn't actually mean you're necessarily going to see plaque. Kind of like shocking. In fact, this is going to break some headlines. The total plaque score for 6 people actually regressed. So
That's
despite
very
having
interesting. Mm,
astronomical LDL, there was
mm,
regression of a total plaque score, and I think one had a non-calcified plaque volume regression as well. So again, that's not the majority of people, but the fact that that can even happen
yeah.
really rubs up against modern cardiology dogma. So yeah, when this paper drops, hopefully this podcast can be part of us making some waves because I don't mind being provocative provided there's legitimate things to be discussed. And these are
Yeah.
legitimate findings. They're not the end of the story, but
Totally. Yeah.
they force a conversation that's really difficult and that we need to have because people think, you mentioned the science is not settled. People think some of the science is settled, and it's so far from. And this is going to really reopen the books on, I think, some of the dogma and status quo thinking we have around lipidology. It doesn't mean ApoB
Yeah.
doesn't matter and LDL doesn't matter for your average person. We reinforce that. It does mean context matters, nuance
Mhm.
matters. And the reason I'm so passionate about communicating that importance is because what I said earlier is because in some way, shape, or form, you, and when I say you, I mean the listener, you are an outlier in some metric. And coming to understand what makes you unique physiologically allows you to capture your health. I fundamentally believe that. I fundamentally believe the future of medicine is N equals one medicine, figuring out what's unique about you and then iterating based on that basic understanding to accomplish a health and a lifestyle that you could never imagine for yourself. I think that's the way forward. And so I think there's a broader truth wrapped around this research that I want to communicate, which is why I'm so passionate about it. It's like a case study in physiologic uniqueness.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely gather the passion that's palpable. Without obviously being able to look at the study, I just have a couple of questions around it, and I just want to reiterate to the listener that we are specifically talking about this phenotype, these physical characteristics around people who specifically go low carb and see this deviation in their cholesterol markers, triglyceride, so we're looking at a specific subset of population, and this isn't transferable. I mean, it's literally like, what you were just saying here. It's not transferable to necessarily to the listener if they are not a lean mass hyperresponder. Am I fair in
I
saying
would
that?
say the only caveat I would have, because I do think this research has broader implications, is that the underlying physiology and the truths that we uncover by studying this, I do think will have general applications. So
Okay.
no, an Oreo could not lower your cholesterol, but I do think there's something fundamental about this phenotype that allows us to poke at the machinery of human physiology. This happens all the time in science, by the way, where you study something quirky and you get a general truth. The
Totally.
example I
Yeah.
commonly bring up is that of the Gila monster. Do you know the story of
The
the
what,
Gila
sorry?
monster? The Gila monster, it's like a big lizard with weird venom. This
No.
is a fun fact around, but it's true. Is scientists in the 90s were studying this lizard that had this venom that screwed up the metabolism of its prey. And they're just like, oh, this is cool. Let's study it. And the fundamental compound in that venom, basically, the domino chain of events led to modern GLP-1 receptor agonist. Ozempic, Wegovy, probably soon to be the most profitable drugs in history and incredibly impactful. Like them or hate them, they're impactful on human physiology. So the thing
Mm,
with science is like a good scientist sees something interesting, studies it, and you don't always know what the implications are going to be.
yeah.
Just like lizard
Yeah.
venom causing, the development of a drug that causes weight loss pretty dramatically and is, now being used widely. Same thing with
Yeah.
studying this phenotype. The Oreo,
Yeah.
the Oreo phenomenon. No, your cholesterol is not going to be lower by Oreo cookies if you're the average person, but in understanding what's going on in my body and people like me who have even replicated the Oreo versus statin experiment, or at least the Oreo phase of it, and studying that, we will gain lessons and insights into human physiology that will be generalizable. I believe
Yeah.
that.
I totally appreciate that. And I think just going back to an earlier point around this idea that the science is settled, that is probably the the least scientific statement that anyone could say, because science is literally the progression of knowledge by constantly questioning and constantly never being satisfied by an answer, because it's always deeper. And to your point around N of one medicine, I think that's definitely the general trajectory that we should be going toward, which is funny because, I'm a proponent of saying, the words no one size diet fit, no one size diet for everyone. But in that, like, these outlier diets are never really thought of as in the same conversation because they are such outliers, but they may be appropriate considering the clinical context of the individual.
Absolutely.
Going back to the study, so in terms of what was the study period? Like, how long were we following up these folks?
So it was 1 year prospective trial.
Okay.
So to delve into the details, there's going to be two papers. One was already published. The other one that I'm talking about is about to be published. People were recruited. The average age of recruitment was 55 years. And at that point in time, the average age on a ketogenic diet was 4.7 years. And for the
Okay.
baseline study results, that's 4.7 years of exposure to LDL with an average of 272. And then we compared them to a matched population and saw no more plaque. In fact, they
Okay.
were trending to have a little plaque. And then
So the
this
average.
follow-up study, yeah.
So no, I was just going to say the average exposure that was studied was around 4 years. Did you say?
So in the baseline study, what we could say is people have been on a ketogenic diet for 4.7 years on average, with an LDL average of 272. So if you actually do the math out, it's something like 700 milligram per deciliter a year excess exposure as compared to a control population. And there was no more plaque. But that was the quote baseline because we didn't have on those individuals scans from that 4.7 year mark before. So what we really
Gotcha.
want to do is follow the individuals over time to say in any individual, does plaque progress? So that is the second study. We call it prospective because we get the baseline, then we get the follow up on the individual. And that was a 1 year study. The senior on the study, his name is Professor Matthew Budoff's an expert in cardiac imaging. Now, given how high resolution the imaging is for these coronary CT angiographies, 1 year is pretty standard. You can learn a lot from 1 year. So people are going to say, oh, 1 year is not long enough. We're not
Yeah.
looking at outcomes here. We're not saying, oh, do people get heart attacks? We're looking really with high resolution CT angiography to see is there progression. We'll follow these people for more time. Again, this isn't the end of the story, but 1 year is enough time.
I think
Modern.
yeah, I agree. Look, I think a year is a good amount of time. I don't think it settles it, and like you said, it's not the end of the story. I would definitely want to see, particularly as I have reservations around high LDL-C and ApoB, and particularly at those levels, you would expect them to have progression over a year, but maybe it doesn't rear its head until 4 5 years. Who knows?
Yeah.
And within someone's diet that has that high an ApoB, if you were to deviate from that diet, and we'll get into this around like keto in the mainstream, I just worry a bit that people are going to be exposing themselves to the other necessary but not sufficient exposures that lead to cardiovascular disease. Do you see what I mean?
Yes. So let's break this down and make sure that we're talking in a nuanced and responsible manner. First thing I will say with respect to, say, a 5 year trial, I agree. I want to see those data at 5 years. So check back with me in 2029. It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, we could just wait for 5 years, or we could just show you what the data are now and
Yeah,
then
I
wait
agree.
for time because I don't have a time machine. Sorry, that's how science progresses. Now, to your point of risk mitigation, I would say this doesn't settle. No one study ever settles the science. We just said the science isn't settled. This does throw an interesting wrench into things, but in terms of individual risk assessment, it's so complex. So let me give you two separate patient case examples. These aren't real people. I'm just making it up. There are real cases like this, but for the sake of this argument, imagine you have a child with severe epilepsy, and they go on a ketogenic diet, and their seizures go away. Nothing else controls their seizures except a ketogenic diet. But they're lean and their LDL goes through the roof. And they're intolerant to every lipid-lowering medication. For the sake of argument, let's say that's the case. Then they're caught between a rock and a hard place because they have to say, well, do I take the high LDL and then add back, and then, risk my heart? Or do I say, I'm going to add back carbs, but then I have seizures come back? And chronic seizures can harm the brain. You can see how that's a difficult place. And so you have to make the best decision. You could understand in that circumstance why somebody would say, I'll just take the high LDL. Seizures kind of suck. Or for me, it was inflammatory bowel disease. I said, kind of alluded to earlier, if I had to choose between a shorter life with no IBD or IBD and living to, say, 100, I'd take the shorter life in a heartbeat, even if there were fewer. So it's very individualized. So there's a lot in any individual patient context. And these data, they do inform that decision. I know some people want to say that this shouldn't change clinical management. Realistically, it will. Because if you have that patient with a clean coronary artery calcium scan or CCTA with very high LDL who can't or doesn't want to take a medication and they have a competing medical condition, then these are relevant data to say, yeah, you might be reassured. So that's the one circumstance. And in that circumstance, I think it's totally reasonable to say, monitor and watch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a...
You're not going to have it jump out of Jack in the Box in another year. So
yeah, no, I think that's a really reasonable suggestion that it could inform clinical management, at least in the short term, for an individual who is faced, so a clinician who is faced with a patient who is utilizing a therapeutic ketogenic diet effectively to maintain remission of epilepsy or IBD in your case, or improvements in bipolar, whatever the therapeutic indication is, whilst like maintaining a very high LDL-C and ensuring that the coronary scans are completely normal. Where I worry is people who utilize ketogenic diets as a means to improve weight or because they enjoy it, but they deviate off that ketogenic diet quite often. And I'll give you an example. I was sat opposite somebody at dinner a few months ago, and they were, espousing the benefits of ketogenic diet. I feel great. I've lost weight. Improvements in my cognition. And I'm like, great, that's phenomenal. But also, they're smashing a couple of wines in front of me, and they'll have like carbs at the weekend because that's their cheat day. This is where I worry, because they might be looking at a high LDL-C, but because they've heard that ketogenic diets and that high LDL-C doesn't really matter, it kind of excuses these deviations. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I'm sure you've come across that yourself as well. And this is where I think the public awareness needs to be improved as well around this area.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking to physiology, if you said they're using it to lose weight or they're carb cycling, they're probably unlikely to be a lean mass hyperresponder in the first place. So if their LDL is high, it's probably for another reason. So, to vindicate, just kidding, but like the phenotype we're studying, then it's probably another reason. Maybe they have familial hypercholesterolemia. But to your point of risk mitigation, yeah, I think in that circumstance, if you want me to just say it from, say, the horse's mouth, then take the risk marker seriously. ApoB and LDL are independent risk factors for cardiovascular disease. We just don't know in different circumstances to what degree they confer an absolute risk. So a funny analogy I've used before is like the Geico gecko and Godzilla. They're both lizards, that could, impose risk on, I don't know, something terrorizing a town. But they're different magnitudes of risk. So you're not going to drop a nuke to destroy the Geico gecko. In the same way, like if the absolute risk associated with a particular circumstance is very, very low, you may not choose to intervene, or you intervene differently than if you have high risk. So the absolute risk and the cause of the high LDL and the context around all of this really does matter. And frankly, to the listener, it's your heart. So don't be stupid and gamble on it because of something you heard off the internet. Like, listen to diverse voices, talk to your doctor, and consider a true, meaningful, thought out risk mitigation strategy for yourself. To that end, I'll give a complimentary example. I was on a podcast yesterday, and the host was saying he's a lean mass hyperresponder. has very high LDL, and he actually got he got a clearly scanned a coronary CT angiography, and he had perfectly clear arteries. So one option would be, oh yeah, maybe he's at low risk, he doesn't need to do anything. But he said, I want to try this medication. It's called ezetimibe. It just basically blocks cholesterol absorption at the level of the
Mm-hmm.
intestines. And the response, your liver makes more LDL receptors, takes LDL particles out of the blood. I would say of the lipid lowering medications, it's um, the slingshot in the arsenal, although slingshots can be pretty potent if properly targeted. As in, like, the side effect profile, and given the mechanism, I would say is generally pretty low. So his philosophy was, look, I don't know what the actual risk is associated. I might be low risk. If I try this medication and I have no side effects, and I have no reason to be concerned about long-term side effects of this medication, which is different than a statin or a PCSK9 inhibitor. Mostly, it's working locally in the gut with some like downstream knock-on effects at the liver. But he's like, I see no negative. So in my cost-benefit analysis, or my risk-benefit analysis, the risk to me is basically zero. My insurance is covering it, and I don't have side effects. I'm not worried about long-term side effects particularly. So if that's zero and there's potential upside, I'll take it. All things being equal,
Mm-hmm.
why not? So I think, again, it's individual. That is a totally reasonable choice. I'm not here to say what somebody should or shouldn't do. I'm just here to, one, talk about the physiology and the science, and two, I think, and maybe I don't do this well enough, but try to remove this stigma from any given choice an individual makes.
Mm-hmm.
I think I can think of circumstances where basically every choice, adding back carbs, staying keto, adding a particular medication, is reasonable based on individual context. And I think from conventional medicine, it's stigmatized to not take the medication. And now in some of the health and fitness circles, it's stigmatized to be open about taking a medication. I don't think that's a way to go about things. I think you're an individual, and I just want to say, like, here's the science, here's the nuance. I can't tell you what decision to make because I don't know your whole case. And I want people to internalize, like, that is their reality and truth. They can gather information off the internet, but at the end of the day, they're the ones stuck, or let's say not stuck, that has the privilege and responsibility of making a decision for themselves. And only they can know what's right based on their priorities and how they integrate the data in their mind.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think one thing that sticks out to me is when you see patients, often they are at the mercy of their clinician in front of them, and they are looking toward them to make the decisions on behalf of them because they understand the physiology better than them, they understand the literature, etc., etc. And you're going to be a physician fairly soon, right? You're like in your final year or something, or
I graduate in May. I have come
okay.
out saying that after a long thought out process, I'm actually not going to residency. I have other plans. We can unpack that.
Oh,
It was a
okay,
big decision for me. It was not one that I did not do. I put a lot of thought into it. We can talk about it
sure.
if you want, but I'll be an MD. I'll be an MD PhD, but I will not be a licensed practicing clinician.
Okay, okay.
To be clear.
So as a thought experiment, let's imagine that you are going to be a practicing MD and you're going to be responsible for an individual's uh, uh, cardiovascular health going forward. If you saw someone who wasn't part of this lean mass hyperresponder phenotype and they did have high ApoB levels and they were doing everything else that was healthy in terms of diet, etc., etc., would you be worried about that in the absence of doing any cardiac scans? Because particularly in the NHS, we don't really have the ability to just send someone for these scans willy nilly. We're at the mercy of a cost prohibitive National Health Service here. So, would you be taking steps to reduce someone's exposure to apolipoprotein B or LDL-C?
I would say it should be part of the discussion.
Okay.
Yes. I would want to know more about their family history. So they have a family history of cardiovascular disease, which could speak to genetic factors of susceptibility. What their prior lifestyle has been like. Have they always been super healthy? Or, did they have a history of metabolic disease? One question we could ask about the study I brought up is like, well, why do some people have baseline plaque? And it could be because, average age when they started a ketogenic diet was over 50. It's 50
Yeah.
years of living another lifestyle. You can have insult, and if you have kind of like the seed planted, maybe that's a problem. And so, in the
Mm.
absence of having a reassuring scan, I would say it definitely should be part of the conversation. It doesn't
Mhm.
mean they
Mhm.
must take interventions, but I would say, what is the cost? Are they using a ketogenic diet therapeutically for something? Are they keeping
Mhm.
IBD in remission, depression in remission? Or is it more like, I like the way I feel, but I also would feel okay if I had, half a sweet potato per day or a sweet potato per
Mhm.
day, which I've seen a sweet potato per day lower an LDL by 480 milligrams per deciliter. Lower the LDL by that much. That was the delta, 480 on a sweet potato per day. And so, look, if
Mhm.
you're someone who can tolerate that without any negative metabolic consequences, I don't see a big downside. In fact, I'm
Mhm.
jealous. Like, I use it for IBD remission. Sweet potato, my mom makes this beautiful at Thanksgiving sweet potato with figs and goat cheese dish. And every year I'm like, damn it. There are a few carbs I miss. So, like, what is the true cost to you? It's individualistic. Sorry for a little bit of a cop out answer, but I would say not definitive. It should be part of the conversation. Yes. I would not just say, oh, you're good.
Yeah.
I don't think that's
Okay.
responsible.
Because I think that is a prevalent, and I don't want to point to any particular people within the carnivore keto community, even if you can call it that thing. I just think there are some
Actually, do
dissenting
it.
voices.
Do it.
I don't know.
Point. No, no, I'm
as,
serious.
as,
No, the reason I actually want you to, if you don't mind, is because what I've found in the social media space is it's incredible to hear the caricatures people develop of you, because
uh-huh.
rage bait pays. So there are people that believe that I have extreme positions that I don't have, nor have I ever voiced. In fact, I've said the
Mm,
opposite. But there could be this other situation where you're having a conversation with someone else, and they ask you the question to like point out who said XYZ, and you're like, oh, I think Nick holds this position, and I fundamentally don't. I am interested because I know a lot of these people who might have more nuanced positions, and on the
mm,
off chance that they do say these extreme things, we don't need to hold, like, we can disagree cordially. I don't know if you've been following Instagram, but kind of probably the ugliest interaction I've ever had on Instagram recently. I tried to pull back from it a little bit. It got nasty, like
oh, really?
Holocaust comment.
Oh,
But that
wow.
aside,
Oh, gosh.
one of the comments that the individual in question rendered against me, in a reply, was something to the effect of like, "Well, why would you, uh, collaborate with these people who you don't share a perspective with?" Like, it was something, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but like, why would Nick collaborate with these people if he doesn't share this perspective? And I read that and I'm like, really? Like, your bar is that I need to agree with everybody else on everything before I collaborate with them, that we need to have a carbon copy of each other's perspectives?
Mm,
I'm actually somebody who's pretty good, I think, to pat myself on the back a little bit, of like, people in my circle or in my perceived camp. If somebody in the low carb camp says something, I'm like, this is ridiculous, like, I'll call them out. I try to
mm,
do it privately, but generally people are receptive to having their commentary called. I will give
yeah.
examples if you don't want to. I'm a pretty pokey and provocative guy, but I'm interested in who you're thinking about, truly. And I
Yeah.
will take
Yeah.
responsibility for you to call them out. But tell me.
No, I will tell you afterwards. Don't worry. But there are
Okay.
certain people who, because I'm just, this is not my nature to call people out. I just think it's
Fair.
like a
Right.
flagrant sort of academic self virtue signaling, whatever. But in terms of some prevailing ideas is that you don't need to worry about ApoB being high or LDL-C being high. You're good as long as your information levels are low and all the rest of it. And I think whilst it might be true, and I'm not saying that the science is settled on this, I think as a general rule of thumb, it would be incorrect to say that, given the weight of evidence that we have around these markers and cardiovascular disease.
I agree. I'll endorse that statement.
Okay. And I think I agree, uniformity of opinion is dangerous. And I would argue against that. You should be just hanging out with people who share your views. Part of the reason why we're having this podcast in the first place is because we might have different views. And actually, let's go back to the saturated fat point at the start of this pod around how you. I'm interested in this idea of like false equivalency that you talk very eloquently around, about how potentially the impact of saturated fat on some of these markers doesn't necessarily mean that saturated fat is bad for us, all within the context of saturated fat not being one thing. There are many different types of saturated fat. Butyrate, for
Mm-hmm.
example, acetate. These are all very healthy saturated fats that are produced by our microbiota. So, what is your position on saturated fat, and why do you think the evidence for saturated fat being harmful is weak?
Um, because I would say people have this transitive property idea in mind that saturated fat on balance will increase LDL, and LDL on balance increases heart disease risk. Therefore, saturated fat increases heart disease risk. But that doesn't track that well with the actual data. Like the data on increasing a saturated fat intake, increasing heart disease risk and outcomes is pretty weak, including the sources. Like if you go and read the 2025 dietary guideline for Americans, like document, it says like there is like little or weak evidence or inconclusive evidence with respect to these things. And
Mm,
nevertheless, it's somehow like it's very like actually contradictory terminology. I was surprised when I read it, like even like in within some sentences, like the evidence is weak or non-existent, but this is what we conclude anyway. I'm like, these two things don't track. Um, nevertheless, so it's again, it's taking things out of context and creating a fear and um, a forcing a diversion away from things that can be quite healthy. And I
mhm,
actually want to give the example. I want to give a counter example that might resonate with people on the other side. So one could say saturated fat is bad for you, and therefore don't eat red meat, or don't eat dairy. Dairy actually ends up. A lot of people admit it's like in its own class, despite being high saturated fat. Dark chocolate, whatever.
yeah.
But you bucket all these things, then people tend to avoid those foods, which can be very healthy. Dark chocolate, red meat, they can be very healthy. Dairy can be very healthy. So I think it's bad to vilify a whole category of foods that are rich in this nutrient because it just doesn't track. And the counter example I'll give is that of seed oils, right? I would say the people who tend to believe saturated fat is bad for you and saturated rich foods are bad for you are also going to be the people who are like, oh, but seed oils are just hysteria, right? But it's the same track of logic. I would say, yeah, having a high omega 6 to 3 ratio in your body is bad for you. Seed oils, quote unquote, are high in omega 6. But does it track that you should avoid high omega 6 foods as a blanket statement? No. It doesn't track that you should avoid walnuts or tahini or sesame or these other
Mm,
foods that tend to have good health outcomes because the whole food is a complex ecosystem and has complex impacts on the body. So, to give one of my favorite examples of sesame, yes, it's about 40% linoleic acid, which is itself a fragile omega 6 fat. But if you look at, is this fat actually that fragile in the ecosystem of the sesame, in the tahini, or the sesame seed or the sesame oil? It tends not to be because there are these lignin antioxidants that are packaged with the sesame. So if you actually look, at least in vitro, at the like oxidation curves, it's so much flatter when you look at the whole oil with these antioxidant components that are packaged in the food. Um, so we like to tend to reduce things down to nutrients, then vilify those nutrients and expand out to include the foods. I would say that's inappropriate logic. I would say
mm,
I won't say saturated fat in a given individual can't increase or affect a biomarker that might have relevance. But you can hear all the caveats there. It
yeah.
therefore does not track that you can only eat red meat once per week for health. I'm going to say one more thing, and I promise I'm going to shut up. I get on my monologues. But
No, no,
one of the
go.
reasons I think is so hard to have is that topics bleed into each other. And what I mean by that is somebody might be really passionate about climate conservation, animal welfare, and therefore be biased to interpret the literature around red meat and health in a particular way. And I'm not disregarding those as important things. I don't think 8 billion people can eat a carnivore diet. I don't think it's sustainable. But that doesn't actually comment on whether red meat is good or bad for the human body. And so I think we have to parse this conversation in order to actually then later integrate it and have an evolved conversation. Like you need to say like, what does the data say on this precise thing we're talking about? Let's take carnivore diet and inflammatory bowel disease. Like this carnivore diet could be incredible for inflammatory bowel disease, maybe the best thing ever. Obviously, I'm being, extreme right now for a purpose. It doesn't then track that it's the best diet for everyone, that it's healthy for the microbiome long term, that increases longevity, that, broccoli is a scam or whatever. These are all separate ideas. And I think one of the reasons it's so hard to have these conversations around saturated fat, red meat, seed oils is because topics bleed into each other. And it's so hard when most engagement is short form to kind of parse those issues. You know what I mean? People just stereotype you and believe that you hold a set of opinions. I can't tell you how much people have labeled me with certain extreme right-wing ideologies because I eat a ketogenic diet. And I just sit back and I think this is like, how do you possibly infer my position on a woman's right to choose whether or not to have a baby based on the fat ratio in my diet? It's ridiculous, but people jump to these mental conclusions because we are so exposed to these stereotypes and echo chambers.
Yeah, yeah. And this is why I was really looking forward to having this conversation, and I'm super enjoying having this conversation, because when you get to know an individual such as yourself, you are very, very reasonable, and I think you're right. The topics do bleed into each other, and people make judgments based on diet, because diet is so visceral. It is, which is why you have so many people speaking passionately about plant-based diets from a vegan persuasion, and you have these literal fights online between these different camps. And actually, there's probably a lot more common ground if people actually care to listen to each other. But the short form nature of our communication is actually short circuiting a lot of the genuine interactions that we could be having, which is why I'm a big fan of long form podcasting, because we can actually have a nuanced conversation.
Yeah, no, generally people I think are pretty reasonable when you can have the long form. Sometimes though the short form like kind of trips up the long form. I had an interaction recently, we don't need to get into the specifics, but where I had reached out with someone that was not of like mind. I kind of assumed that they might come after me at some point, and invited them to the long form. Now, I genuinely believe they didn't see this invite. Things kind of spiraled out of control, and it was this, issue I was talking about just now. And then it was like, there was so much poisonous rhetoric already in the space that the way they wanted to go about doing a long form, which after the fact they seemed open to, I was actually just scared about inciting further violent rhetoric. Like there were people making death threats, making anti-Semitic comments, like things had already gone so far. It's sometimes hard to pull back. But on the other hand, like there are some people that I'll call out that I think are really good at opening up a discussion. I had one conversation with, I don't know if you've spoken with Simon Hill.
I haven't, no, but I do know of him. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, okay, right. I mean, every now and then we get into like online bickering matches, and maybe they're probably mutually hard feelings back and forth. At the same time, like to his credit, like we once sat down for like a 5-hour long podcast and we had a great conversation. He probably still doesn't agree with everything I do online. That's fine. Nevertheless, we could set things aside, come to the table. I'm not going to go over the 5-hour, set of content we discussed, but I just want to express gratitude for one, his willingness to have that conversation and other people like him. And two, one thing I do love about social media is that there is a tribe for everyone. And I use that word very intentionally because I know tribe has come under fire as something kind of dirty, like you're in your echo chamber. But in a world of poor metabolic health, you could say like, food pushing, dietary booby traps, having a support community is important. And different people are going to succeed with different approaches. So it pays to have communities and experts within those communities who are leaders, who can serve different people. I know not everybody's going to have success on a ketogenic diet, even though it's tremendous for some people. I love to be a voice of leadership for certain people. But if somebody else is like, look, Nick doesn't talk at my level. Also, I want to do more plant-based. And they end up, say, gravitating toward, let's use Simon Hill as an example. And they use his wisdom, his information to get healthy. That's awesome. Like that is genuinely so awesome. At the end of the day, if they're healthier, I am so happy for them. So I love that we have broadly a community of diverse voices and people can find their home and niche. I do think we need to work on having more open, long form discussions. Nevertheless, even where it bites me in the butt, and it does because I have a target on my back and people go after me, despite all that, in the greater scheme of things, I'm really appreciative for those, even the detractors, because I do believe the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority are in it because they believe they're doing the right thing and they're trying to do what is right by their audience and what they've been sensitized to via their exposures, including their personal histories. On the whole, I think that makes for a beautiful intellectual ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, when people get to listen to you outside of the short form tweets and stuff, I think they will recognize just how reasonable you are and how nuanced you are. And I think, just to echo, things that you've said, you're not suggesting that keto is for everyone. You're not suggesting that it is a magical formula for a long and healthy life. You're not even saying that it's good for your gut. You're saying that for certain people, it can be therapeutic. It deserves extra study and recognition as a way of putting conditions into remission, but also allowing for nuance within the risk profiles and characteristics of these individuals, particularly the lean mass hyperresponders, as an example. And not to put words in your mouth, but I feel that we lack that within the scientific discourse to actually appreciate people who are stepping outside the bounds of our guidelines when they are literally guidelines, not the rules.
Yeah. No, I mean, medicine, whether or not I'm going to be a practicing clinician, I can't appreciate what medicine is, and it's an art. And it's an art of making hard choices with incomplete information. And the science will always be incomplete, which is actually what makes it exciting as a scientist. So people need to appreciate that. There's no one silver bullet, that just because there might be a negative effect of an intervention that you like doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't detract from your narrative. It just is. And the more we can be intellectually honest with that, I think that's a power, not a weakness. I truly do. I think people see it as a weakness. Like, I talk, in provocative manners about, like, okay, you don't need fiber. Here's what we don't know about fiber, yada, yada, yada. At the same time, I'll say,
Yeah.
I think on balance for most people, fiber is probably a decent thing. And I also express reservations about saying going on a very long-term fiber-free diet. That does not detract from the amazing things carnivore diets have done for some people. I think it gives it power by saying, look, we can acknowledge the limitations of this thing. Nevertheless, it's having a tremendous impact. And I think by speaking with a softer voice, we can have bigger impact. Sometimes. And other times, it pays to be provocative. And I do want to, I know we're probably coming to time, but I do want to discuss and invite your audience to give me true feedback, and invite you to give me feedback right now on some of my conduct, because I like to be transparent about my motivation. And sometimes I'll put something out in short form or long form, or do something like my egg experiment or my Oreo versus statin, where I know it's going to provoke emotions. I know everybody's not going to get it. I know that. I know it's clickbait too. It's 100% click. I'm not like pretending it's not. But my purpose is to stimulate conversation, because like me or hate me, like the Oreo statin or the Oreo versus statin or not, like that worked at getting conversations started. Even if people were like, "Hey Nick, why'd you do this? This sucks," and people got confused. I'm like, but now we're talking, and now I have 5 hours. It worked. And more to the fact, actually more to the point, to give full transparency, like the knock-on effects of these sort of things are incredible. So one, clinically, it got the word out there about, research we're doing, including randomized controlled trials, meta of RCTs, to clinicians who weren't aware. Then they understood the physiology. Then they started implementing the physiology in their clinic. So I've had doctors, including cardiologists, reach out to me and said, I had a lean mass hyper responder in my clinic. I didn't know what they were. I only became aware of it because of Oreo versus statin. They were statin intolerant. Now I have lowered their ApoB by like 200 using sweet potato therapy. And I wouldn't have been aware of this if it weren't for Oreo versus statin. So there's already having, I guess one could call, positive clinical effects, but also people who understand the game, because to some extent the game, are then willing to say, I like what this kind of spunky out there person is doing, and now I want to fund the trial. Because guess what? I'm a 20-something PhD scientist, medical student. I'm not getting multi-million dollars from big pharma or from the NIH. So if I have a project I want to do, how do I get it rolling? And there are philanthropists who are now backing projects. We have actually two in the works. One has a $2 million budget, one has a $3 million budget. And these are now achievable sums for me and my team to achieve off the back of things that are ridiculous as me eating a bunch of eggs. I know it sounds silly. I do. But if you can force a discussion, the currency of the modern realm and the creator economy is engagement and attention.
Mm.
And so if you can do something provocative, but then show up as the scientist who says, and here are the papers that I published on it, and I can have a long form, nuanced discussion, then people are like, well, what could this person do if I gave them some actual resources?
Yeah.
And so I tell you this, and I tell your audience this, and I tell everybody this basically, because it's like, I like being transparent. I like being authentic. Know why I'm doing what I'm doing because I'm going to keep doing it. And the fact of the matter is, it works, and I'm going to keep doing it until it stops working. Because there are important conversations we need to have, and there's important research that needs to get done. The NIH, Big Pharma, aren't giving me the money. I need to find another way to do it. And if I have to eat freaking Oreos or 720 eggs in a month to get it done, I will do it. I just will.
Nick, you're a fascinating individual, and this has been one of my favorite conversations. Honestly, it's brilliant. Look, people should definitely go check out some of the experiments that you've done, like we didn't even get to it, but the 720 eggs experiment that you got on your YouTube channel. Cholesterol Code, I'm going to go check that out as well. It's out later on this year, you mentioned. And you mentioned that you're not going to be... Sorry, go on.
Mm-hmm. I think it's going to drop in like September or something. We haven't found out on what platform. The PR team's taking care of all of that. I mean, I can say this because I have no idea where it's going to end up. Like, fingers crossed, Netflix or Amazon Prime. I'm biased, obviously. I think it is. If it was on Netflix, I think it'd be the best nutrition documentary on Netflix that there ever was. Yes, I'm biased, but like, it was
very interesting.
So good at actually, one, being non-dogmatic, two, communicating science in an accessible, genuine way, three, showing that science is a process that everybody can engage in, and then four, and this was the real art, tying together so many incredible, touching human narratives. Like, there's this one story, I'm not going to get into the details, but like, every single mother in the world will see that story and have their heart wrenched from their chest.
Gosh. Okay.
And then, like, young men will be touched by narratives of young men, older women, older men. Like, there is something in there for everyone that I think you'll just like understand the human element and be drawn into just how human science is.
Yeah, I love it. I'm very, very intrigued. And you mentioned you've taken the decision not to be a practicing MD. What is next on your trajectory in your career?
I can't give the exact details, but what I would say is, I found myself over the course of med school in a very unique place. I had a patient history. I had scientific training. I was training as a clinician in medical school, so I had like the medical perspective, the patient perspective, the scientific perspective, and fourth, I had the perspective as a young person coming up in a world that is complicated by social media and social media communication. And I was just thinking, what am I good at? Where can I have an impact in the world? What do I want to do? And I came to that point, where I think a lot of us do at some point where we're like, there's so much I want to be. I want to be a scientist. I want to be a public communicator and a patient advocate. I want to be a good father and a husband. I want to be able to take care of myself, get some sleep, exercise. And you get to that point where you're like, oh crap, I actually can't do it all well. And I tried to think about like, what do I love? What do I get up for? And what I realized was what I get up for in the morning is getting people enthused about metabolic health and the science. Like, in my beginning of my final year, or even in my third year, I'd be in my like internship, my sub internships, sitting in the like intern room doing tasks for patients with my colleagues, and be like, to be a fantastic superstar doctor, I need to be all here for my colleagues, on this medical team for my patients, and my brain just wasn't. It was like, oh, I saw the highlight about this new Nature paper. I need to read it. I just need to. I need to find a way to figure out a story to tell around it. That's where my heart was. And it was a big thing for me to come to the realization that my heart, my calling wasn't in medicine. And it's not because I don't respect medicine and doctors, it's because I have so much respect for the profession. It is such an admirable profession. It's the one I grew up admiring. To say in myself that this isn't my calling, that this isn't even my gift, one could say, it was a hard admonition for me. I think there was some element of shame therein. To be like, I'm not worthy of it. But then I came to the realization that, like, look, what brings me joy is the science and communication. This is where I think I can have the biggest impact. And if that means stepping away from the career that I imagined myself for my entire life and leaving it to other people, my incredible friends, and people that are devoting themselves to this, including I'm watching my girlfriend go through surgical intern residency right now. It's remarkable what she does. Like, I'm actually really proud to be like, they can do this better than I can. I know what I'm good at. I know where I think I can have the biggest impact, and I'm going to jump off the deep end and try to have that impact. Because, this is, a biomedical and scientific ecosystem. We all have our parts to play. I'm just finally figuring out what my part is. It was a really hard decision. It was the right decision for me. And I just want to express gratitude for all the people who supported me. I was really scared about telling my family, my mentors. One, people might know Dr. David Ludwig at Harvard. I was more scared about telling him than my own dad. I remember I'm like, David, I'm not going to residency. And his immediate response was like, I've been watching you, Nick. Like, I know what you're passionate about. If this is what you put your thought into, like, I trust you to make the right decision for you. So I've received a lot of support. And all I'm going to say is what people have seen from me thus far in my, say, rookie year in the public is nothing compared to what you're going to see after graduation. I'm devoting my life to this. I am so excited to grow and develop as a communicator. And I have so much gratitude for my friends, my family, my mentors, and the people who take the freaking time to listen to me ramble for 2 hours about metabolic health or go on my YouTube channel, get excited about me talking about nature and cell metabolism papers. It's so cool that we have this community. I'm grateful for the time and place I find myself in, and for especially everybody listening, because they make it worth it.
Yeah. Nick, all power to you, man. I see really, really big things when you're putting all your energy into this. If you're doing this whilst completing medical school, like, it's obvious that you're going to be an incredible communicator. And I want to, support people like you who have this, what do you call it? Provocatively reasonable approach. And I really love that.
Leading to reasonable. There's a lot of variations there.
Good on you, man. I appreciate you. And we should definitely do a part 2. I've got so many other questions around topics around metabolic health, and I'm sure our podcast listeners will as well. So appreciate your time, dude.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the conversation.
If you loved that episode, you will love the full library of podcasts from the Doctor's Kitchen library. We talk about everything from inflammation, supplements, and food as medicine. Just like this episode right here. You can click it right now and check it out.